All right, Hebrews chapter 4, and our text will be verse 2. And just a thought that comes out, there's a lot of things here in the chapter. As the writer here is making a lot of comparisons in Hebrews, showing these Hebrew Christians under the new covenant, showing them what they'd come to believe and receive, and encouraging them not to turn back. But to do all that would take so much time. But with the time that we have, just a thought of when good news becomes unprofitable. And in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 2, it says, "For unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it." So what he's been dealing with into chapter 3 and coming into chapter 4, the provocation, which is what the name he gives to when the children of Israel are getting ready to go into the promised land. And they come there in Numbers 14, you can read it, where they come, Moses sends in the 12 spies. Of course, Joshua and Caleb said, "Let's get up, let's go." God said he'd give it to us. But the other 10, they said there's armies, they've got chariots of iron, we're as grasshoppers in their sight, and because they're giants, and we can't go up and take them. And so into chapter 3, we see there in verse number 17, "But with whom was he grieved 40 years, speaking of the Lord? Was it not with them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? And to whom sware he that they should not enter into his rest, but to them that believed not? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief." And what he's going through is that all those children of Israel that came out of Egypt, they had all seen the 10 plagues. God had brought them through. They had all come out of the Red Sea. They'd seen God work there. They'd seen God provide for them. All these things. But they come to the promised land, and God had spoken to them. God had given them a promise. He said that he would drive out their enemies, that he would deliver them, that he would allow them to enter into the land. He also gave them promises. We don't have time to look at them all, but he gave them promises that they would dwell in houses that they didn't build. Not just that they wouldn't build, they wouldn't have to pay for them. That'd be nice. They would eat of fields that they didn't plant. They would take a harvest that someone else had done all this labor for. That's some good news. That's a good news. And he says there, he used the word gospel, and that good news of that deliverance coming out of Egypt, what God was going to bring them into, a house that I didn't have to build, food that I didn't have to work for, and just sit there. He's going to drive out my enemies. That's good news that they heard. But what we see in chapter 3, verse 17, is that their carcasses fell in the wilderness, as God was grieved with them for 40 years. And what he says in chapter 4, verse 2, is that the word preached unto them didn't profit, because it wasn't mixed with faith of them that heard it. All that group, they heard the good news. They heard what God was going to do for them. They heard the promises of God. But there was only a few that believed it, Joshua and Caleb and the younger generation, but everyone else, they fell to a lack of faith. They didn't believe the promise of God. They said, well, we can't go up, and that was never the issue. God says, I'm going to deliver them in your hand. And so the faith was, take God at his word, go up and take the land. Just trust him. Yes, we might be grasshoppers. Yes, they've got chariots of steel, but we've got a God who gave us a promise that we're going to rest on because he's faithful. But it didn't profit them anything, because it was not mixed with faith. They heard the good news. God said, houses you didn't build, fields you didn't plant, it's all yours, I'll drive out your enemies. But instead their carcasses fell in the wilderness, in a desert place, and wondering, because it wasn't mixed with faith. In Acts 27, Paul's on a ship, and he recommended that they wouldn't set sail because of the winter, but they head out and didn't listen to him. And they get to a point where, it says for some time they couldn't see the sun or the moon or stars didn't appear because of this storm. And they were lighting up the ship. They were casting things off. And it got to the point where many of them were getting ready to just give up hope. But what Paul does, he comes to him and he says, the angel of the Lord hath appeared to me this night. And God says that all of you on the ship with me, your lives will be spared. And he said, I believe God. But he says, howbeit we shall be cast upon a certain island. And so what Paul's dealing with is a group of people, no hope. But he got a promise from God. He was on a boat with sailors. Sailors knew what they were doing on the sea. But there was a God above who said, not one of you is going to be lost. And then we see later on in Acts 27, the soldiers go to cut the lifeboat and take off the shipmen, I believe it was. And Paul says, unless they stay on the ship, they're going to die. And so there was a promise of salvation. There was a promise of life. And Paul said, I believe God. He stayed on the boat. That belief brought him to a place where he could eat and say, be of good cheer. And they all ended up taking cheer. But he said, unless you abide on the boat. And then it says the soldiers cut away the lifeboat. And so their only hope of salvation was to stay. It went against everything they reasoned, everything they knew. But the good news was a promise of God. But because it wasn't mixed with faith, it didn't profit them anything.